you. Thank you very much. We'll do one final presentation before the break. But I just like to let you know that I want to welcome more FM 91.7 in Jamaica who are streaming this conference live on their radio program. So I'd like to welcome people from Jamaica signing in and listening to this. I really appreciate Patrick Williams and the people at More for streaming this live to Jamaica. Thank you. So the next speaker is going to be Dr. John Oliffe. And I'm going to make John a co-host. So I'd like to have Bayo Oladele introduce Dr. John Oliffe. Go ahead, Bayo.
Dr. John Oliffe is a professor and a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Men's Health Promotion at the School of Nursing, University of British Columbia, Canada, with a joint fractional appointment at the Department of Nursing, University of Melbourne, Australia. As founder and lead investigator of UBC's Men's Health Research Program, his work focuses on masculinity as it influences men's health behaviors and illness management, and its impact on partners, families, and overall life quality. Findings drawn from his research offer guidance to clinicians and researchers in psychosocial prostate cancer care, smoking cessation, and male suicide prevention. John has also leveraged descriptive research findings, and needs analysis to design and formally evaluate tailored e-health and community-based interventions for men and their family. Please welcome Dr. John Oliffe.
Morning from the West Coast here in Vancouver. It's delightful to be able to share a little bit of information and maybe have a bit of a conversation about masculinities and how we think about masculinities and stress management today. So I'm going to just move straight through. Some of the things I talk about today, they can kind of trigger some experiences that might have been pretty challenging for you all. I encourage you to reach out to me, to engage in the chat, to sort of work in with some of these. So mental health is not always easy to talk about. I try to make it pretty straightforward in terms of talking about how we might think about it as men and how gender might be involved. Just to say, I've got I usually have deliverables within a presentation, so I know I've got 45 minutes and probably a little less, so I'll try to get you to your break on time. But just to say, there's kind of 18 things I want to do. I won't belabor them here, but I'll just launch in and we'll try to piece them together a little bit. The year is 1969, and I'm just tilting my 6th year. I'm like about 6 years old, and I'm in the front row of a town hall in a mining town that's aptly named Broken Hill, and it's in the state of New South Wales in Australia. And it's an important day because I am going to graduate grade 1, and the deal is that you walk up the 3 stairs, you turn to your left, you shake Mr. Jenkins' hand when he calls your name. He hands you the certificate and you gather on the left-hand side of the stage. And so I've had some challenges at this point around alphabet and arithmetic, and I'm not really tracking super well, but I'm so delighted to graduate grade 1. So Mr. Jenkins starts calling the kids' names: Karen Afford, John Bautez, And I'm kind of edging towards the end of my seat because I know I'm mid alphabet. And then it's Michael Noonan. And then it jumps to Olivia Otto. And then he calls a slew of P names, R, S, T names, until Mr. Jenkins at the end says, and the final person in the graduating class of 1969 in Broken Hill is Anne White. I look to my mum, who's with me, and I say, what's going on? Like, I didn't get called. And she doesn't answer me. And then my teacher, Miss Trudy, at the end of all the kids graduating, like grades 1 through 6, she comes to me and she says, in a kind of weird civilian-like voice that I hadn't heard in the classroom, she says to me, hey, great to have you in the class, John. Have a great Christmas. And I couldn't lift my eyes to look at her because it would have been the final indignity of knowing that my grade 1 class just graduated without me. And it is affirmation that I kind of failed grade 1 in a mining town. So I'm like, I just literally couldn't deal with it. The drive home in the car with mum, I say, took a very long time for a very short distance. And every time I tried to raise the issue about what happened, how come I didn't graduate, it got shut down. About 3 weeks later, my dad came home from traveling for work and he says, we're moving. We're moving from Broken Hill to a place called Adelaide. And I'm like, okay. And I thought as a kid, I might have been in the witness protection program at that point. I thought, you know, it might be the kids who kind of fail grade 1, their parents are so ashamed that they move them to another part of the country. So we moved from New South Wales, where Broken Hill was, to South Australia, where Adelaide was. I'm the kid who's forever in the back of the classroom, who's forever struggling. And in something that I still can't explain, they put me into grade 3. Even though I failed grade 1 in Broken Hill, I was in grade 3 in South Australia, and I was battling, big time battling. I reflect on this a lot, and it helps me to think about how we protect our boys from vulnerabilities, how we kind of don't acknowledge, you know, the things that might have gone better, that we tend to want to keep them out of harm's way. And it's a great reminder. And I think we do it because we're trying to help them avoid vulnerability and we're trying to help them build resilience. And I'd say that little boy's still here for a lot of us men as we grow older. That kind of that resistance, that put the Band-Aid on, that cover it up, the vulnerabilities are incredibly hard to talk about. I think in the space of mental health, we get these examples of really successful guys who talk about their mental health challenges. And we kind of like go, that's great. We're kind of destigmatizing it. But for many of us, we kind of keep it inside and we kind of push back on the vulnerabilities. And I would argue that prostate cancer, it disrupts us. It is a vulnerability of all sorts around relationships, around our mortality, around our morbidities, around how life is going to be. And they're hard things to talk about. They're really difficult. And part of what I'll share today is that if we don't talk about them, if we don't find a way of adjusting, of working our way through, they can manifest as mental health challenges. So my point of all of this vulnerability talk is to say that we need to be able to destigmatize the issues around mental health and specifically around men's mental health. I think COVID, if it had a silver lining, it was probably that when I talk to people now about anxiety and depression, they know what I'm talking about. I don't think any of us were untouched. I think COVID just created a great deal of uncertainty. It slowed things down to a point where you thought about the past. You had to and some of us kind of got caught in the rumination of that. So very challenging times. So just to say, the talk is really important. It is not easy, but I've got a few ideas. We do a lot of work with men around depression. depressive symptoms and anxiety. And we ask them to take photographs of their experience of mental health and mental health challenges. And here's a little theory about what happens in terms of many men's lives when they have what I'd say is an injury. So it's kind of interesting. This picture was taken by a 20-some-year-old man, but I think it still resonates, you know, as we grow older. It's a picture of an apartment block that is condemned, that is going to be torn down. And he's referencing his mum and dad who divorced, and neither one of them expresses an interest in having him live with them. And then he has a relationship that seems to be tracking okay, but his girlfriend dumped him. And he just says, eventually, you might just end up being abandoned. You're going to be abandoned. The point of this slide and the point of the picture and the point of his narrative is very much around this idea that we carry injury. And things that we sort of think we should get over, we don't always get over. And I think as we grow older as men, a lot of times these injuries accumulate. Like they're a cumulative effect. The weight of them tends to bear down on us. Because if we don't fully deal with the injuries, they kind of have a way of pushing us. So the other thing that happens after the injuries or with the injuries is we tend to look inside. So this interiority. So we look inside for resources at a time when we're quite fatigued and depleted by the injury, and we're trying to find our way through a lot of these injuries. We're trying to be self-sufficient. We don't want to burden anyone. We don't want to ask for help. We kind of just want to fix it. It needs to be better. We kind of know that. We might deny it. We might even blunt it. So a lot of times we'll do alcohol and or drugs to sort of kind of blunt some of the things we're feeling. So this is a lovely analogy from a 54-year-old man who says, you know, you can get locked down, locked into your thoughts. And then he kind of dovetails into a little bit of quote at the end there where he says, you know, if you don't know the combination, then you don't know how to get out of the depression and the suicide. But if you know the combination, you're able to unlock. And it's just a beautiful analogy about how we look inward to try and deal with things that are troubling us, i.e. the diagnosis of a prostate cancer, a treatment, the aftermath of a treatment, the adjustment in the relationship, all of those things. So we know that when guys push down their emotions and they suck it up and they don't cry, they lose touch with their feelings. Impulsivity is one thing that kind of can happen, but also the recognition of what you're feeling and the management of the distress are completely impeded because you're denying what's going on. So it can be really, really tough. And the third thing, the third I, is around isolation. So oftentimes when guys are going through injury, this interiority is kind of failing, but they're still in the space. There'll be this isolation. So this guy, 60-year-old guy driving home from work, he works in an open office plan. So there's like 100 people in this office space. So he's not alone, but he's profoundly detached from everybody who's there. He's quite alone. And he says, this is his drive home. And he says, it feels like everyone's separated from the world and you're just all by yourself. It's a feeling that's so unbearable. You just want to get rid of that feeling forever. Just a really poignant example of when problems don't get addressed, how they can get driven inward, and we just might not have the resources to deal with it. And then we tend to conceal and we tend to isolate. And isolation is one of the biggest risk factors for suicide in men. So again, we want to try to get upstream of this. The full paper is available freely online. It's called Injury, Interiority and Isolation in Men's Suicide. It's suicidality. It's well worth a look. It gives us a bit of an insight. So I wanted to invite you into the conversation because I firmly believe that support groups do such great work. I need your help with a scenario, to be honest, and maybe we can facilitate some comments into the chat and we can hold them till the end, or there might be an opportunity here to kind of speak up to kind of help me work this out. So Jimmy leaves early for work these days, and he seems to be staying late, even though he doesn't need the overtime. He's also withdrawing from friends and family. He no longer sleeps in the same bed as his wife. He's been changed by the prostatectomy for his prostate cancer. His thoughts are scattered, and he misses sex way more than he ever imagined. So my question to you all is, you're kind of sensing Jimmy's pain here, but I just wonder what we would say and what we would do. What would be the ways that we would connect? How would we get the conversation? How would we engage him in the opportunity to speak up?
You want him to put that in the chat, John?
Yeah, Ken, happy to put it in the chat, but if there's someone who'd like to respond, it might be nice if we've got a minute or two to get a sense. Because I'm sure there's lots of wisdom out there about how we might, how we might engage Jimmy around this.
If someone wants to respond verbally, they can raise their hands and I'll open the line for them.
Okay. Shall I just keep going in the interim, or shall we wait a little? Okay. Appreciate the awkwardness of Zoom sometimes.
Yeah.
But I really want folks to think about this, because I actually think this is the work you do in your group every day.
It is.
Yeah. So I'm keen on understanding the wisdom. So I'll keep going, and maybe we can revisit at the end there. We've done work with prostate cancer support groups in Canada since the early 2000s. It was the first grant that I ever got in Canada, and it was such a joy, nationally funded, to help us look at the great work you all do. And one of the things we noticed really, we went to all of the groups in British Columbia, and one of the things we noticed that the guys use humour really well, which I think is important to be able to get a conversation about things we don't normally talk about. You do an amazing job of teaching health literacy. When I've been a clinician, I was a clinician for 20 years in an emergency room. And when I first went to groups, I was just so struck by how you talk in numbers, like the PSA, the Gleason. It's kind of, and also that orientation of guys to the health literacy they need to be able to have the conversation with the healthcare professional to be able to make informed decisions. So we wrote about that based on what we saw at the group. We thought you did an amazing job in terms of helping people think about their options in terms of treatment, what the trade-off might be in terms of side effects. We noticed, at least in British Columbia, that a third of the people who went to prostate cancer support groups were women, and we felt that they were like the social glue, but also they did an amazing job of supporting each other, because sometimes the partners, don't get a lot of airtime in terms of working through some of the things and the adjustments that are happening for them. So again, we spoke about that. And we also, polled all of the urologists across Canada to see what their connection with your groups is. And it's strong to say that when a urologist or a prostate cancer specialist endorses a group, or even just mentions the possibility of groups, men are 3 to 4 times more likely to attend a group. So again, I think some of those connections are really well built, and their relationship to groups versus general practitioners' relationships to group, like far and away, specialists know that you're out there and of the great work that you provide. So again, just to say, it's a shout out that I know that you can work with the last scenario and you would know how to talk to a guy. So I'm super interested to hear at the end about, some of the pearls of wisdom you might share that would help us all think about how to get those conversations, because sometimes they're not easy to get. I want to just say a little bit about healthcare as well. We often talk about guys not seeking help. So I often believe when a guy's got prostate cancer and he's in the system and he has specialists working with him around treatment decisions and the aftermath of being treated, we still might be a bit coy and a bit uncertain about other forms of healthcare. And I think mental health is one of those. Like oftentimes, when we audited some of the urologists' charts, you know, they might prescribe an antidepressant, for example, but not necessarily refer to a talk therapy or some kind of specialist mental health care. I think we need to think about that, because this is a big adjustment for guys and their partners when prostate cancer hits. It's just to say that oftentimes too, guys will ask for help or think they're asking for help and either not get it or not be able to quite articulate what's going on for them. So we see a lot of men who come in with somatics, I mean physical kind of ailments, and it's really they're wanting to talk about their mental health, but they don't quite have the ability to do it. And sometimes we absolutely miss the questions that we should be asking. So I'll give you an example. Depression in men manifests quite differently, we believe, to women. So we often see men who are angry, irritable, using substances, risk-taking, over-involvement in kind of sports and work. And so the typical way we'd think about depression showing up would be crying, introspection, low affect. So those things might be there as well, but we're predominantly seeing these other things in men. So I do some work with Simon Rice out of Melbourne University, and we've come up with a male depression risk scale, and it's showing very, very solid results. It talks to all of the things I just mentioned. So we're trying to diagnose depression in men in a different way because we believe they show up angry, irritability, substance use, risk-taking. So you can see here, I've just outlined the main kind of items that we ask about in terms of substance, for example. So these whole domains, because we believe if we can diagnose depression better in men, we can think about how to treat. And it's not always medication. A lot of time guys are really good with talk therapy. Anxiety is interesting. The way I differentiate anxiety and depression, uncertainty about the future is anxiety. Regret about the past is depression. And so very simplistic terms, but oftentimes those things can coincide because, especially in a COVID context, we had time. There was a great deal of uncertainty about the future, like when are we getting out of this? When are things going to return to normal? What is the new normal? And we also had this weird time for retrospection, to think back, the could have beens, the should haves, all of those things. Wish I had, because there wasn't enough happening live. So just to say that, you know, anxiety, we also believe manifests slightly differently in guys. We are more likely to pick up anxiety than depression in fellas. There seems to be a bit more of an openness to it. When guys talk to us about anxiety, depression, they talk about stress. They do not talk about depression and anxiety. They say, I've been a bit stressed. And the obligatory thing to do is to ask about, so what's going on? How is that for you? To try and get that conversation. The upshot is that men connect really well by doing. So you're doing the work of prostate cancer, you're doing the work of orientating other guys who are on the journey to the journey, or how it can be. Men's Sheds does a similar thing. It's big in Australia because the government put money behind it. It's growing in Canada, but it's run on volunteerism, much the same as your groups. But it's just to say that it does a great job of connecting guys, because oftentimes the sight unseen stuff that you do, you're great at orientating to prostate cancer, but the other thing that's happening is there's a social connection that's clear as. And it's beautiful because it avoids the isolation. It helps to bring people together. And we know that guys are really good when they connect by doing something, when they're cause driven. So again, just to say there's things out there that really help us. One of my favourite things is when I started going to the groups, they often open, especially the group in Victoria here in British Columbia, you know, they'd say to guys when they first came to a group, welcome to the club that nobody wanted to join. And the guys would, you know, kind of talk openly. There's a real way of bringing them into the group. So important. It normalizes a conversation. It gets rid of the one-upmanship we do so often in groups of men where we're kind of competing or jockeying for position. It just stills the waters in a way that you can bring people in to get an authentic conversation. There's one thing that I assure the groups out here about. The leaders will often come to me and they'll say, hey, John, you know, we've still got a core group of guys, but we don't retain men. Like guys come and go, and a lot of them, you know, come to one meeting and maybe not come back. And my assurance to the leaders and to you all is that if a guy can come and get what he needs in one visit, you're providing a very fine service. Not everyone stays, and it's okay. It's great when they do, but if you're providing something that is remedy or elixir, oftentimes people will come and go, and they'll bracket their experience. It's okay. It's really okay. It's that the service and the honour continues with the group. So just to say, we believe in community-based work, and we think it's a great de-stressor for men, you know, to have a place to go to. So this article talks to a whole bunch of different, you know, opportunities out there for guys. So I was just in the US, and we had a great conversation about the black men's barbershop. So a place where guys would routinely gather, wait for their haircut, you know, and just kind of shoot the breeze. And what got inserted into many of these barbershops was things about blood sugar levels, where they'd actually take blood sugar levels at the barbershop, you know, get a conversation about how things are tracking, how things are going. Really important conversation with the barbers initiating that. Blood pressure checks, just to kind of not force guys into a space where they might not feel comfortable or be familiar, like professional healthcare, but a kind of a place where they ordinarily go just to kind of transmit some messages. We do the same here. We run a program for veterans who are returning from war or active service. You know, we're a veteran-friendly campus at UBC, so we get a lot of vets in, and we run a veterans transition program. And again, we work with those guys around their language. So they talk about dropping the baggage, you know, unpacking some shit. They talk about, and it's important because it's their language. We also recruit guys to this program. It's actually counselling psychology. We'd never call it that, but it's actually, you know, it's a program, and we recruit and we say, hey, you're okay, but there's some guys at the group that could really do with your help. And they show up. They just show up because it's a military code, but I think it's a man's code as well, that we'd always help out other guys. And so they come into that space. So just to say, there are opportunities aside from professional help that can really help guys, and clearly you're in that business. We worry about guys who can't get to a group, you know, that idea that maybe they can't travel, or maybe the Zoom thing is kind of like out of their reach and stuff. So we do offer a website. It's called If I Were Tom, and it's an opportunity to track Tom as he's making decisions, from finding out he's got prostate cancer and working his way through decision making and alike. And it affords the opportunity to make your own decisions. You're just tracking him. He's not telling you what to do by any means, but you're just kind of getting a bit of a sense of the journey, a bit of a visualization. So for guys who can't get to a group and get your all expertise, this does an okay job of providing guys with a space. The other one I want to just bring your attention to briefly is a website called Heads Up Guys. It's for guys who experience, you know, or are challenged around mental health, and it offers a whole slew of resources where you can self-evaluate your mood, where you can think about some resources that are embedded in the website. 50% of the people who go to this website, and it attracts 50,000 visitors, unique visitors every month, are women. So, you know, women who want to support guys who might be struggling with mental health. So about 50% of the traffic there. So again, it's got a special spot there for supporters of men who might be challenged, but it's also got lots of direct action stuff for the guys. We talk about sleep, we talk about stress management, social life, physical activity, food, sex and relationship. We cover it kind of all in a way that would just bring you into a conversation that many of us might want to have, but might not always be able to find the avenue to get. Just saying, the traffic to this website has been great. Oftentimes these things, you know, after 5 years, they'll be kind of tapping out, and they might have, you know, had their use by date. This thing has prevailed and actually grown. You can see the tilt there in 2020 when the pandemic hit, and you know, it's interesting. Many folks come to this website and seem to find, you know, some kind of help or a bridge to professional care. So just putting it out there that there might be someone in your life that you think would benefit, or indeed, you know, you might benefit directly, might be helping out a mate, you know, all those sorts of things. It offers good respite. I want to just briefly talk about relationships, because we don't talk about relationships enough. Movember, who've been a great supporter of the Men's Health Research Program here at UBC, came to us and they said, we're really concerned about men's relationships. And we want to better understand how guys, you know, cope with relationships, what sort of strategies they have. And it was really such a wise kind of thing for them to ask about, and it was great work to do. We hadn't thought about it. But if you think in the prostate cancer context, oftentimes relationships are incredibly important, and especially intimate partner relationships. There's shifts, there's changes, and there's adaptations that we've got to do. So just to say, this was an interesting project. One of the guys who we interviewed really early on in the actual research was from Toronto. And George was a 26-year-old African-Canadian man, and he's been living with his girlfriend for 3 years. He loves her very much, and he helps around the house. He does a pretty good job. He kind of says it's equal. However, when George hosts his parents for a meal, he does not help with the meal or any womanly duties. He's got a bit of a problem with that. And he says, you know, I'm just not that courageous. You know, my dad would cut loose on me if he saw me doing that kind of stuff, and he's referring to womanly work. Maybe we'll table it for the end Q&A. When I spoke to George, I was amazed, right? Because, you know, the sanctity of relationships, a lot of times you don't know what goes on for guys. And I just love a cultural read on this. I'd love to understand what's going on here, you know, and how we think about how we are as role models, or what pressures or what kind of intergenerational aspects of masculinities we might be passing on. I'd just be super keen if you could help me analyse this one, maybe at the end. Relationships are super important. We know that in a good relationship, functional relationship, we know that the mental health benefits are massive for guys. They are in much better places when things are tracking well. By contrast, when something is distressed in a relationship, the mental health issues, they pop. So a man who divorces, that year of separation, that first year of separation, he is 8 times more likely to suicide than a woman who separates. He is also 3 times more likely than the national average of males in Canada to suicide during that period. So we know distressed relationships and relationships that end cause a massive amount of challenges to guys. It's weird, sometimes when we talk to guys, they talk to us about the relationships happening to them. So oftentimes as guys, we'll have objectives, goals related to work, related to what we're doing, you know, but our relationships, we might not have really entirely thought through how they're tracking, what the goals of the relationship are, you know, what's working, what's not. So we can be bystanders, and we can be quite withdrawn within the relationships as well, just to say when we're talking to them. And the vast majority of relationship work is done when there is intimate partner violence or domestic violence. So again, there's very few services around that help us build relationships or maintain relationships. And just a nod to COVID, you know, in British Columbia, we've got a very long line of divorces waiting to go through the courts. One, because the courts slowed down, but two, because there was never, I don't think in history there was ever more pressure on the domestic sphere than putting people into a confined space where they couldn't go to work and they couldn't travel and they couldn't do other things, literally locking them down, I think it put a lot of pressure on relationships, and our divorce rates are very, very high and rising in British Columbia. Just you know, an artifact of perhaps the untold stories so far of COVID. I call them COVID casualties. So what we learned from guys when we spoke to them, they talked about getting a sense of themselves and what they actually wanted within the relationship. And I think that shifts over long-term relationships. I think it shifts over short-term relationships, but certainly in a prostate cancer context, thinking about, you know, how that shifts. So think about me, identity first, and then we, what it means for us. And I think that's something we need to do. A lot of guys talk to us about, you know, a breakup as prompting them to think about me, then we. And it's just unfortunate. There's so much turmoil in breakups that I think if we could just offer something earlier on to guys, we might be in a far better space. And a lot of guys talked about the things they could have done better in relationships, but it was after the relationship ended. So it's about trying to make those adjustments within the context of the relationship. And the one that popped most was definitely about communication. So sometimes we talk about relationships, but we don't talk about the relationship. So we'll talk to our partner and it might be about what we're doing next week, or, you know, where we're going, you know, for a holiday, what the vacation plans are, what's happening with the kids. But we might not actually talk about the relationship and how it's tracking. So again, just that guys talk to us about this idea that perhaps, you know, they'd benefit by a scheduled time to chat through the relationship as what the relationship is tracking, how we're coping. The things I'm enjoying are, the things that I think we could adjust are, the things that could be better are, you know, and having that forthright conversation rather than assumptions, especially when guys get blindsided and they're just taking things for granted or just not aware of someone's maybe discontent within the relationship. Just in terms of help, I think we've stereotyped the help around relationships a bit, that it's going to be some kind of talk therapy every time. Many guys go to the internet. Many people break what I think is code and talk outside the relationship to trusted others, being friends, family, but also find other guys a great refuge to be able to chat about what's happening for them. So I think we've been very narrow in how we've talked about help seeking in relationship, but it's super important. It's really important. When I think about COVID, you know, I think about financial hardship, distressed relationships, job insecurity, and social isolation. You know, it was a pretty abrupt kind of change. I think it's also the transformation back is very, very kind of uncertain. So I don't think any of these things have gone away. We're staring down a recession. We've got really good history of understanding what recessions do for mental health, especially men's mental health, with those pieces around financial hardship, distressed relationships, job insecurity, and social isolation. I call it the perfect storm. And we've polled guys across Canada, and we've got good empirical base to know that the mental health challenges at the moment are really high and rising in the return to whatever the new normal is. So I just want to put it out there that, yes, there's these contexts around prostate cancer, but the world has changed a little bit as well. And so we've got these other things that are happening. It's never just one thing. It's usually a collision of a bunch of things. I think we've endured a very divisive time in terms of how we treat people. In Vancouver, we've had a rise in downtown violence with the lockdown. There's been this divisiveness about masks, this divisiveness about vaccinations and status, about, you know, who did what in terms of vaccinations and all that. It's been really a tough time where we've kind of lost community. And I think that's, you know, that's a bit of a challenge. People often ask me, they say, John, what should I do, you know, if I'm concerned about a guy in my life around his stress levels? I'm borrowing this from Movember. I think it's just great. We call it ALEC. Ask, literally ask. How you doing? What's going on for you? You seem a bit flat. Where you at? Like, what's going on? What's happening for you? In a concerned way. And then the job is to listen, you know, like give them a chance, because you've affirmed that you want to know, and then you just want to give them the chance to talk, the affirmation, the permission. and listen. Just listen. It's not your job to solve the problems, right? You don't want to diagnose him. You don't want to talk to that. You just want to listen. You want to honor his narrative, and then you gently encourage action. It's not your problem to solve, but you're encouraging kind of what's worked for you in the past. Try and get it into a space of, there's some things that have worked for you well in the past. Where are we at with that? How's your sleep? How's your food? How's the diet? Getting some exercise in there. Maybe we can catch up. Maybe we can do something, go for a bit of a walk, connect. And again, that check-in, when a guy discloses and you've listened and you've encouraged action, you must check back in. Because what happens is a lot of times we're like, oh, I said too much, I disclosed too much. And guys aren't meant to really kind of talk, right? So that notion of coming back into the conversation, it might not be the fully fledged conversation, but it's the affirmation that it's okay, that you have a relationship, that you're able to talk, that you're able to reconnect. So, never be shy on asking or re-asking, and just checking in, and just being there. So it's really, really important, that check-in piece. I'll finish with a few single words. There's a discordant relationship between men's depression, because we diagnose it at half the rate of women, and they suicide at 4 times the rate of women. So that's a discordant relationship. We believe it's related to the difference in the way guys show up with depression and anxiety, that we're not tracking well, that we're not seeing it in ways in which it's actually in front of us, because it doesn't necessarily fit a generic code of, depression, or what we think depression looks like. So there's differences in how we show up when we're a bit flat, depressed, depressive symptoms. And there's diversity within the category of men. So by that, I just simply mean that there's some groups of guys who suffer or are more at risk, live in marginalising conditions. And that can relate to the social determinants of health, money worries. It can relate to ethnicity, Indigenous ancestry, for example, in Canada. Gay and bisexual men oftentimes have a fragile relationship to healthcare. So again, there's the kind of diversity within who's most affected or most likely to experience depression. Talk about shame a lot. It's almost impossible to talk about shame for guys. It's such a hard thing, but we carry it, and we carry it all the time. And it might be little things, it might be just regrets. Very, very hard. And there's massive stigma. And I talk about stigma as society stigma, but also we carry a lot of self-stigma. If we're not tracking well, not at the top of our game, a lot of times we'll be very, very hard on ourselves. And social isolation, as I kind of mentioned at the front end, it's really hard to connect when you're not feeling great. But, guys are so good at being a cushion and being there for each other. There's a lot of peer stuff that works really well. Hacker your groups. Just to say, to be aware of how much you can do as a peer-to-peer. And the point after, my point, I don't know if it happens for you all, but I still get kind of called on, John, you do men's health, what about women's health? And we've always been deeply relational. So we kind of think that if you do men's health well, and you are doing men's health, you are also doing women's health, family health, because it's all connected. So this is a picture of a mum who lost her son to suicide. He was just a teenager. And this is one of the most powerful photographs that we've collected. And she gave us permission to use it to actually give this message. And that is that we, when we do men's health well, and when we make a difference in a man's life, and you can, and we do, then we all benefit, because none of these things happen in isolation. We're all deeply connected. I want to thank you all for the opportunity. It's great to get up early and get some sunshine here in the West Coast. It's all blue skies. I appreciate your attendance, and I genuinely want to thank all the folks at Walnut Foundation for the opportunity. I just ask you for one thing. That'd be, we're doing the study that I mentioned, where George, we interviewed George. We're continuing that study, and we're interested in talking to guys who are 19 to 44 years of age about how they build relationships. We think it's really important. There might be guys in your life that would love to talk to us. It's just a Zoom interview where we talk to them about, their relationship. It's been quite amazing. We've interviewed some 60 guys from across the world. So we've been very inclusive about all guys to try and get a sense of that generation. So just a shout out, if there's someone in your life you think might benefit by talking to us, there's a $100 honorarium to honour their time for chatting with us. Just we'd love for you to refer them to us with the details there. And again, just thanks for hearing me out.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. That was amazing. There are a number of questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask Nana to read them out, and you can respond to them.
Thanks, Ken.
Go ahead.
Thank you again, Dr. Oliffe. So the first question is, what's the prevalence of anxiety and depression in men with prostate cancer compared with other patients with other cancers? Is there any qualitative difference in the stress between those with low-risk prostate cancer, which virtually is never lethal, versus those with advanced and metastatic cancer? I'll let you answer, then I'll continue.
Okay, what a great question. So it is to say, I'm blanking a little bit on the exact stats, but to say a man with prostate cancer is at heightened risk in comparison to the general male population in Canada for anxiety and depression. Yes. So in terms of getting down to the fidelity of the treatment modalities and where those differences might pop, I don't have that data, but I do know I've read a bunch of things that suggest that ADT, for example, might result in a flatter affect for guys. So it might manifest as depressive symptoms. So again, there probably is some differences around treatment modality and indeed trajectory about where you are on the illness journey with prostate cancer. And I think it's, we often talk about attribution. So attribution being, can you show cause effect? And I think prostate cancer would be one of the many things that goes on in guys' lives that might be a contributing factor, because we know that as we age, a lot of times we're a little bit more vulnerable to mental health challenges as well. So I'm not, so there is a heightened risk with prostate cancer, yes. There probably is some subtle differences based on treatment modality. And yet these conversations at your group are incredibly important, because the chances are the guys who come into the group are battling. They're probably feeling a bit alone in it. They're probably really juggling with ideas about what it's going to be like, that uncertainty, what comes next, in lots of different spaces. So again, a shout out to the group that you're probably doing this work really well, but it's just a reminder that there would be some need in the folks that are long-standing group members, as well as the guys who are just showing up.
Okay, thank you. There's a follow-up question. Are patients with prostate cancer screened for distress routinely? Do you have that information?
Right. Yeah. So I don't know that they are necessarily screened for depression. It's, or distress. So it's so interesting. We would like it to be the case. Suzanne Chambers out of Australia has argued for the distressed monitor, and just to ask guys about distress, because we think it's more palatable than asking about depression directly or anxiety. Like distress will give us an indicator. Super important. It's not always routinely asked, because sometimes when you're with a specialist, they might be very, very focused on the treatment modality and the prostate cancer, which is fair enough because that's their gig. And they might not ask. That's not to say, but we also might battle to speak up to say, and there's this going on for me. I'm feeling flat. I'm short to temper. Things are not good at home, and we might not find the room for it, and the physician might be focused on something else, and we might not have the referral, you know, to some kind of other areas. And this is specialty work in a lot of ways. So again, I'm not sure that it's typically included, and sometimes it's on us to, you know, ask for the help and find the help, you know, independently, or to maybe raise it, you know, with a specialist to say, hey, there's these things going on. Not easy to do, but not routinely. As far as I know, you know, I couldn't say 100% that it's happening across the country. I'm sure there's physicians who are really great at it and do get it inserted there, but oftentimes it'll be on the guide to speak up.
Okay, thank you. Just a few more questions. What is the prevalence of anxiety and depression in the population, in the general population? And I think you answered a little bit of the last question. How can men with prostate cancer overcome depression or anxiety? Do they need treatment, medication, or can meditation, exercise, etc. be enough? How can we know?
Yeah, so the stats in Canada and the US and Australia is that women are more likely to get diagnosed with depression and anxiety. It runs about 8 to 10% higher. So I think it's roughly 13%, 13, 15% self-identify. Guys tend to not self-identify, and I think by extension tend not to be diagnosed. So they run at about 7, 8%. So, you know, so there's that sex difference between men and women about who gets diagnosed, who doesn't, who acknowledges or who self-identifies as depressive symptoms and the like. So there is a sex difference there. And like I mentioned, you know, when we think about the typical signs and symptoms of depression and anxiety, I think we're missing some things that we need to pay attention to in guys. They show up differently. As I mentioned, around anger, aggression, substance use. And the second part of your question, just remind me there. Second part of your question was?
Yes. It was asking, how can men with prostate cancer overcome depression? Do they need treatment, medication, or any other?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there is a differentiation between depressive symptoms and depression, right? Like the clinical diagnosis of depression is usually based on a 2-week kind of loss of interest, oversleeping, or changes in sleep, very low affect, not enjoying the things that you typically enjoy. Like that's an extended period. So that might get you into a diagnosis frame, but depressive symptoms for the everyday, where you're kind of flat, you might be flat one day, a little bit, you know, low on it all, low energy, just quick to temper, that sort of stuff. That's okay. We've got lots and lots of things we can self-manage around that, you know. So social connection is incredibly important. Like, connect with people, even perhaps if you don't feel like it. Like, show up, be there for other people. That's a great way. Meditation, I love. I use the Headspace app. You know, just and it can be like a 30-second, 3-minute kind of thing to just, you know, get you started on your day. Exercise, I can't endorse strongly enough. And it doesn't have to be this whole, you know, 90 minutes or 150 minutes a week. It doesn't have to be that. It just has to be a routine, getting out there. It doesn't have to be high-end exercise. It can be a walk. It can be some company on the walk. It can be some solitary stuff on the walk with the iPods in and listening to something, some music, just some stuff with that. Exercise is so interesting. You know, I still run, 3 days a week, and I'm not breaking any land speed records. Let me tell you, I'm like on the 3-song run, but the best part of my run is the warm down when I'm just walking back, because it helps you just think through things. So all of those things where we're just managing mood are so helpful. So you don't have to jump into professional care. A lot of times you don't have to jump into medications. A lot of guys do really well with talk therapy, just shooting the breeze with someone who's independent of their life, but who they can disclose to in a safe environment. A lot of guys benefit from that. So again, it's just trying to build your team, build your strategies, because we all need it, right? It's, let alone the challenges around, prostate cancer, we all need to sort of pay attention to it, you know, especially I think at the moment.
Okay, and just one more question. I'm going to allow one of the participants to talk.
Sure.
So they will ask their questions directly. Eugene, you can go ahead.
That from Eugene.
Mm-hmm.
Eugene, you have to unmute.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. No, I didn't have a question. I'm not sure what happened there with the hand going up.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I have a question for you. To what extent does understanding the culture of an ethnic group help towards addressing mental issues? The Walnut Foundation has a monthly support group for Black men with the caption, "A Safe Space for Black Men." Is safe and effective positioning for ethnic groups?
Yeah, totally agree, right? So, and I heard you earlier, one of your earlier speakers speak to this in a really nuanced and eloquent way. I think it does matter. You know, there's a sense culturally, a lot of times we don't, you know, we might not even know we're in a cultural kind of space, and there's things that culturally are very familiar and very comforting. And I think that a lot of times, if you're in that space with other guys who intuitively know some of your background and struggles day to day, it can be so helpful because it takes the aloneness, because it's not just, you know, it's not just you going through things. You understand there's people that are experiencing similar, and that there's probably some strategies they might share that would be strength-based. You understand masculinity from a perspective of your cultural and your ancestry, how that works. Because again, you know, when I look at George's narrative, I need your help to undo that, because I think there's cultural aspects to that, to kind of think about where that's coming from, what that pressure might be like, how we role model masculinity and influence other people around us. So long answer to a great question, which is, yeah, it does really matter. We have a club here called the Dudes Club, and it attracts primarily Indigenous men into a space where they it's downtown east side, so it's a place that's challenged by socioeconomic status and homelessness and the like, but it draws those Indigenous ancestry men into a space, and their mantra is leave the armor at the door and come into the space. It's a safe space and connect. And I know they draw great benefit from that. Empirically, that it shows, but you can see it when you go to the groups. It's just beautiful because they love connection. Like it brings them back into that cultural ancestry space. And I'm sure it pops for you as well with the group. I'm sure there's a lot of comfort in knowing, you know, there's people around you that share some level of ancestry and insight into the culture. Because the beautiful thing about culture is if you know the rules of a culture, because we have them, you also know how to break them legitimately and for good purpose. So it can be strength-based, that you might transgress a cultural norm that we don't talk much. In this context, it's okay because I got the permission of other guys, and we're breaking code a little bit, but we're getting it done. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Thank you very much, John. Are you going to be sticking around with us?
I'm gonna be popping in and out a little bit,
Okay.
Ken. Yeah, but thank you again for the opportunity, and kudos to the work you'll do.